All right, well, today we are in the third part of a series called Rhythms. Now, if you're new here, what we like to do is take our messages, kind of like a TV show with episodes. We like to take our messages and clump them together with a common theme. And over the last couple weeks, we've been talking about like rhythms, routines in life that will really help us to thrive. And here's where I want to start out. And this might catch you up a little bit if you haven't been with us. Think about this. Ready? When is the last time you felt rested, like in the soul or internally? Like whatever you want to call your heart, your inner life, your spirit, like within. When is the last time you felt like things were rested? And I'm not necessarily talking about like being on the beach, like moments of rest where you're, physically, but this feeling internally like you're not striving to get somewhere. Right? Like we live in a society, in a culture where we're constantly going and we're hurried, we're stressed out, we're rushed, and we're going and going, not just to get things done, but often it's coming from this like need to prove ourselves, to make something of to feel like we're enough. Am I doing enough as a parent? Am I doing enough as a student? And so we're just striving and striving. It's this feeling of it's this feeling of striving, but never really arriving. It's not like you're pushing it, and then you hit the mark and you're like, okay, now I can, right? And so this idea of a rested, like soul, is becoming more and more rare, right? It's harder and harder to find rest within you. On week one, the example I gave you were these two Olympic runners. They ran in the 20s. One guy, his name is Harold Abrahams, and the other guy is Eric Liddell. And they were both asked about their approach to running and really to life in general. And this is a great picture of a soul at rest versus a restless soul. When Abrahams was asked, he said, he ran the 100 meter, right? He said, I'm always in pursuit of something, and I don't even know what I'm chasing. He said, I have 10 seconds to prove my existence. 10 seconds, he's talking about that 100 meter race. Like he's just trying to make something of his life, and he's not really quite sure how. He's fast, he's an Olympic runner, but he still feels like he hasn't quite arrived. And so his soul is like restless. He's just trying to keep going. And then Eric Liddell asked the same thing. These guys are actually rivals. Eric Liddell asked the same thing about his approach to like running and life. And he said, well, God made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure. Like to me, that both of them are running, like pretty close to the same speed. Both of them are working very hard, but internally, the state of what's going on, one is totally restless, like wheels spinning, never arriving, and the other one, his soul is at rest. And so the question we've asked them is like, okay, well, how do we get there? Like, what do we do to find rest for our souls? And we've been looking at these words that Jesus said like 2,000 years ago because people were like struggling with the same thing. And here's what he said. Maybe you're familiar with these words if you've been in church for a while. Here's what he said. He said, come to me, all you who are weary, tired, and burdened. Like it feels like you're carrying something, right? He says, and I will give you rest. Now notice, he doesn't say just rest if you're weird. He says, come to me. And so I'd hear this like when I was younger, and I'm like, okay, well, where? Like, okay, here. I like the idea of rest, but like, is there an address? Can I ask Siri? How do I get there if I feel wearied and burdened? And here's what he says. He says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. He says, and you will find rest for your souls. This is what we crave. Now, if you don't know, a yoke is something that you put on like an ox, right? It's a tool for doing work. And so they would take a yoke and they would put it on a big animal and like pull a plow. It's a very work-like thing, and that's not what you'd expect. He's talking about rest. You think he'd be like, oh, come to me and like sit on my couch and you'll find rest, or like, lean back in my, no, he's like, take my yoke, like your ox takes that yoke. But what he's talking about really is like back then, rabbis or teachers, what Jesus was, they had a yoke, which was a way of teaching. It was a way of life, a way of doing things and seeing things. He's talking about developing rhythms. In essence, he's saying, like, follow me. Let me show you how to go through life, and you will find rest for your soul. Like that constant striving will finally like put a stop to that. And so we've been looking at really what this looks like. And on week 1, we talked about having a day of rest, a Sabbath, not like a religious day of obligation where you got to do like all your, check your boxes, but a day when you avoid all the ought tos. A day when you do things that like will only fill you up. And like for the past several weeks since we talked about this, I tried to keep Thursday as like my day where I rest, because on the weekend I'm kind of busy, right? But so on Thursday, that's like, and I have been like so much more intentional about these past few weeks, and it very quickly has become something that I look forward to. Something that's energizing. My wife does it on Fridays, and for her, it's something she's come to look forward to. And so we try to work from rest rather than work for rest, like to rest. So we talked about a day of rest, and last week Tom talked about having a rhythm of prayer, which might be new for a lot of you, but taking a day at a regular time, like and rather than looking at it just as a time where you go and ask God for things, but it's a way to gain some perspective. So the big things in life, they seem like big things. And the things that are really small things, they stay as small things. Things don't, like, it helps us to see a little bit more clearly. And when we make these like rhythms, it has a way of preserving and bringing us to this place of like rest. Rest for the soul. So today, in the time that we have left, I want to talk about another rhythm. Now, this rhythm is a rhythm that really should be seen as a discipline, like as something we do regularly, but often is seen as a luxury. Like something we do when we get to, if we have time, if we can, and if we squeeze it in. And we often like don't understand the importance of what we're talking about today. And it has led to a whole world of problems, not just in the church, but in our culture. There's an origin story in the Old Testament, the ancient Jewish writings. It's in the book of Genesis. It's the story of the garden with Adam and Eve. If you've heard that story, some people have a difficult time believing that story, right? Because there's a lot of things that don't happen every day in that situation. 2 naked people in paradise, like what's that like, right? Maybe that's hard for you to wrap your mind around, right? If you just take those like doubts, hesitations, questions, set them aside for a minute. If you like look at what's going on in that story, it is crazy. Like it is mind-blowing to see how much it reveals about the human condition. Like origin stories. If you ever seen Batman, like Batman Begins, or The Joker, or any of these superhero movies, they tell us where they came from because it explains how and why they are the way that they are. And that's really what we can get from this origin story, even if you have your doubts and hesitations about believing it. Just set that aside for a second. I think you'll see something pretty amazing. So, if you know the story, here's how it's going, right? Things are being made. God's like making things. After everything he makes, he has like a little mini celebration right after. He like makes something, he's like, that's good. And he makes something else like, that's good. And he keeps going, and he's like, that is very good. He looks at everything very good. But then there comes a point where he recognizes that something is not good. It's the first not good that we see. And maybe you're familiar with this passage if you've been in church for a long time, but I think we need to like just sit with the magnitude of what's being said here. Here's what happens, right? So he's made everything, said it's all good. He gets to this point and says, then the Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be. Now he's looking at the person he's just made, right? He's just like formed this human being. He's like, it's very good. But then he notices something that's not good. Now really stop, especially if you know what's coming next, all right? Just stop for a second. Think about it. There's a million things that are not potentially good about a man in a garden, right? He could say it's not good for the man to be cold. It's not good for the man to be hungry. It's not good for the man to be bored. It's not. There's a million things he could have. But instead, he points out one thing. He says, it is not good for the man to be alone. Alone. In this origin story of why people are the way we are hit with this, like the initial opening statement of watch out for this is watch out for loneliness, for being alone. We were made for meaningful connection. For me to show myself to you and for you to embrace me, and the other way around. To be accepted, to have a place of belonging, and to feel connection. We were wired for that. And really, like, especially if you know this story, we just like fly through, like, oh, this is the part where someone else enters the story. No, just that is the one thing we're given right off the bat. Oh, there's an issue here. It's interesting. The health commissioner for New York City, he just came out earlier in March. He said right now we're really only beginning to see the side effects of the last 2 years. Emotionally, mentally. And he said it's become very clear that there right now is an epidemic of loneliness. An epidemic of loneliness. It has been an issue, but it's just continuing to get worse. And it's not so much that people are actually alone, though sometimes that is the case. It's more that there's this feeling of being alone and cut off. And so we're in crowds, but feeling completely lonely. In 1985, there was a study done, and they found that 1 out of 10 people feel like there isn't someone in their life that they can rely on completely from an emotional standpoint. 1 out of 10 in 1985. In 2005, they found that 1 out of 4 people said that there wasn't someone in their life that they could rely on completely from an emotional standpoint. This year, in 2022, 2 out of every 3 people have said that there is not someone in their life that they can rely on completely from an emotional standpoint. There's an epidemic of loneliness, of this feeling like people don't really know who I am. And I can't really come out with how I am, who I am, and how I feel. And so we're retreating into these feelings of isolation. The CDC about the same time just recently came out and said that people who feel isolated are 50% more likely to develop dementia, 39% more likely to suffer from a stroke, and 25% more likely to develop heart disease. In other words, like, it is not good for man to be alone. And this was written thousands of years ago. As if to say, like, watch out. This is an issue. There's a writer for the New York Times Magazine. And this was written like over 10 years ago, a while ago. This guy, decided to do a little experiment, got on Facebook, created a Facebook account, and he very quickly accumulated 700 friends on Facebook. And so just for fun, he decided to have a party. And he made an event and invited all 700 friends to the party. And a few people expressed some interest, but when it came time for the party, 0 showed up. And so he writes, 700 friends, and tonight I'm drinking alone. Like the issue for us, for you and me today, I think for most of us, maybe not for all of us, but for most of us, like loneliness, the feeling of loneliness, it's a lot less likely for us to just find ourselves completely isolated, right? That's easy to identify, but instead we're living in this illusion of connection. In the digital age that we're in, now listen, I love technology. I'm not saying social media is bad, right? That's not the point here. But what I am saying is that if we're not careful, we can think that we are getting what we need from a relational standpoint, from social media, and we're not. And it may actually be making us like less effective when it comes to establishing real relationships with people. There's an illusion of connection. We did a whole series on shame last year. We talked about how we need to feel accepted, how we need to belong, how we need connection, how important that is to us. And shame is the feeling that we're unworthy, right? And so we like push back a lot of times, we'll isolate ourselves when we're feeling shame. Right? The issue is that for connection to happen, there needs to be a sense of exposure, right? Like here I am, and this is actually in the origin story as well in Genesis, you should read it. There's exposure, they're like naked and unashamed, right? And they're embraced. They're fully known, they're fully seen, and they're fully loved. Exposure, embrace. That's how connection happens. If you have a close friend, you know, they know the real you. They've seen the real you, and they embrace you with all your issues, and that's connection, right? In the digital age that we live in, we're living in a hyper-controlled, curated form of exposure. And so the embrace, like the likes, follows, and friends that I have are a counterfeit form of an embrace. And it's not meeting the needs that we have. It's an illusion of connectedness. And again, I'm not like poo-pooing all of social media, but we have to be aware that it may not be providing what we think it's providing. We crave real exposure and real embrace. Like if you've ever seen Aladdin, okay? Great movie. If you haven't seen it, they just remade it. Fantastic, right? Maybe you've heard me say this before. In Aladdin, if you don't know the story, it's a guy, they call him a street rat, right? He falls in love with a princess, and he pretends to be a prince. And the whole time he's pretending to be a prince, you're like, you gotta tell her. You gotta tell her that you're not really a prince, right? We're rooting. Why? Who cares? Let him pretend to be. No, the reason it bothers us is because we want real exposure. Not a curated form of, I think you'll like me this way, right? Show her the real you. And if she doesn't like you, forget her, but at least show her the real you. If you've seen Shrek, right, which is an old movie at this point, which is crazy if you think about it. Shrek 1, was it like 8 now? He falls in love with this princess. This princess is like starting to like him. Then you find out the princess is really an ogre, and she's got a secret. Once we find that out right away, we're like, you gotta tell him he's an ogre too. You gotta show him the real you. And we want that because we want genuine exposure and a genuine embrace, which makes a real connection. We want that. We crave that. And with social media, we can perfect this version of ourselves to the world. It has us pretending to be princes and princesses. And it's not really who we are. We crave, we were made for deep, meaningful relationships. And this epidemic of loneliness is hiding in the midst of all the likes, friends, and followers. So why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about this in church? Good question. The night, on one of his last nights here, Jesus was sitting down with his friends, his really close friends. And he painted a picture for them of what he wanted his following to look like. His followers, what would become the church. He's like, this is what I want it to look like. Paints his picture, go for it, right? He says this, ready? Here's what he says. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. Now, hold on. If you know where this is going, just pretend you don't for a second and try to look at it through this lens. Saying, by this, everyone will know that you're one of my followers, that you are carrying my yoke, that you're living with the rhythms that I taught you, that if you love not your enemy, that's good, but we covered that already. If you love not your neighbor, also good, we covered that already. He says, if you love one another. In other words, the world will know that you are following me by the way that you guys treat one another, by the sense of connection among this group of people, the acceptance, the belonging, the connection. That's the thing that's going to stand out among everyone and that's going to bring people in. And what's amazing is that that's actually how the church started out. One author writes about it like this. He said, this is how what the church looked like when it first started. He says, these people, they loved each other. These early followers of Jesus, right after he left, they said they loved each other with a radical kind of love. Ready? He says, they took off their masks and they shared their lives with one another. They laughed and they cried and they prayed and they sang and they served together. Those who had more shared freely with those who had less. He says people related together in ways that bridged gender and racial chasms. He says they celebrated cultural differences. And then he says this is the thing that gives me the chills. He says this community, this church, it offered people on the outside a vision of life that was so beautiful, it took their breath away. It was so bold, it was so dynamic, so creative that they could not resist it. This is what the church was made to be. A place where people take off their masks. A place of meaningful connection. This culture of curated exposure and a counterfeit embrace, it's also with it created a culture of performance and perfectionism where we've all got to pretend to have it all together. You're going to see a picture of me post my kids with a perfect filter, and they're all smiling, but 2 seconds ago they were throwing punches, right? But everyone sees my highlight reels and you're sitting there in your behind the scenes. You see the everyday in your life, but you see the controlled version of me. These are masks. They're masks that we live with. And the church was created to be a place where you can come as you are. You come with your ugly. You come with your issues, with your doubts, your struggles. Be real about your failures. And know that you're accepted the way that you are here, that we're going for something greater, but you are 100% accepted the way that you are. It's a place of deep, meaningful connection. So much so, Jesus said, that the whole world would know that we were his followers. And so here's what this looked like. Right? These relationships, these people, and it can't happen with everybody, but in these deep, close relationships, these real friendships, what they did was they let one another in. One another. This is hard, but they were vulnerable with one another. They were real about their issues, real about their flaws. They didn't have to pretend to be perfect. They didn't have to perform, pretend to have it all together. And this is why we talk so often about Jesus and about how God sees us. We talk about identity. We sing this song, I am who you say I am. Why? Because we need to know that because of Jesus, we are completely loved and accepted. Before we will expose the ugly sides of us to people who may reject us. And so we call that knowing your identity, right? We need to know that at our worst, with our doubts, with our issues, we are accepted and loved the same by God. And so when I'm most confident of that, I'm most willing to be vulnerable, to let people in, to see the ugly. There's an ancient Irish term, it's a Gaelic term. The word is, this is probably not how you pronounce it, but it's anam cara. It's a friend with whom you can relax your heart. One you can let in, be vulnerable with. They let one another in. They also build one another up. The writer of Hebrews says the early church should encourage one another daily, to go out. Now, what I'm not talking about with your friends, it's just like being nice, being fun to be around, being cool, being excited, like that's all good. But to intentionally build one another up. That course, I said this, you heard that. It's about how to build one another up. To intentionally see the good in the people around you and to say it. To say it. We are worse at this than we probably think. Right? Like think about the people that you're closest with and the things you love about them so much. When's the last time you actually said, this is the thing I admire so much about you? I see how you go out of your way for your kids. I see like the extra time you put in to provide for your family. I see how you're just so forgiving. They say over and you just like you handle it so well. Like think about, there are people in your life that have no idea how much you admire the things you admire about them. And I think you'd be amazed to see how close that brings us when we're intentional about voicing that. Even with the people in your parents, no matter how old they are. When's the last time you told your parents what you appreciate about them? Or your kids specifically. Like let them, you are so good at this. And it doesn't come easy for me. To build one another up. Not only that, but they also, ready, be careful with this one, they call one another out. Now, what they don't do is like get up on their high horse and like point the finger at everybody who's doing wrong. That's not the idea. But the idea is like when you have let someone in, they know the real you and they have let you in and you have worked to build them up intentionally, so much so that they are so confident you are in their corner and there's nothing they can do to get you out, that you're for them, right? Well, at that point, there comes a time when you see something in their life that might be destructive, that might be hurting them, might be hurting the people around them. There does come a time and a place where it's our job as close friends, like it brings us together to lovingly confront them about it. There are people in your life that have issues that everybody sees. Fixable issues. Everybody sees. But them. And nobody will tell them about it. And probably, like if they knew, whatever, if they knew that the mood changes when they walk in the room because they're so stressed out, I bet you they'd be more intentional about not. Like, I would want to know. Right? It doesn't mean you like drop, I just gotta let you know, I see a problem, but like carefully, hey, listen, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I can't, but just as someone who cares about you, I wanna let you know, like maybe you don't realize how this comes off when you do this, or like we're seeing this with you, and maybe you wanna do like, not from a sense of superiority, but out of like real concern. You know, I got a thing, all right? I got a thing about when there's something in my nose. It's like the worst. You go home, you look in the mirror, there's like something hanging from your nose. And I got to think like, okay, who did I see today? How many people I was out? The longest I think, when's the last time I looked in the mirror, right? When someone comes up to me and they're like, hey, just, you might want to like go to the bathroom, take a tissue, like wipe. I'm like, we are friends now. Like you care. You care about me. Oh, P.S. Like I got a little like bone to pick with the 11 o'clock service. A couple weeks ago, I had a fly on me for about 20 minutes. And it wasn't just a regular like hanging out fly. It was ambitious. It was going in my shirt, out, around. And I've got no idea. I'm standing up here, whatever. And it was great. Right after the service, like tons of people come downstairs like, oh, you had a fly on you the whole time. I'm like, nobody could just be. So now you know for the future. Anyway, there's something that builds like intimacy, and you know this. If you've ever told someone something hard, maybe they didn't even handle it well at first, but eventually you became closer because of it. There's intimacy on the other side of conflict, often when it's handled in a healthy way. They call one another out. So, my question, who are your friends? Are there people in your life that let you in, build you up, and call you out? Are you doing that for the people in your life? Today, if If you can't honestly say, yeah, there are people that are real with me, that are intentional about building me up, that let me in, that I feel like really know me, today, if you can't say that you have that, you are in the majority, because that's become the norm. But it doesn't have to be that way, especially in church, especially here. We were designed, made to be a place of acceptance, belonging, and connection. And so what do you do? Real quick, what do you do? One, you pray for them. Like really, even if you don't pray, just try. It'd be like, when I was in college, I had a group of friends, fantastic, awesome people, had a blast with them. They didn't really care too much about their faith, though, and I was at a place where I had a lot of questions, and so I still spent time with them, but I prayed. This wasn't like the coolest, I didn't feel the coolest, doing this, but I asked God, could you send me a friend that will help me with my questions of faith? And right away, a guy showed up at the restaurant that I was working at who was in the same exact stage of life. We started playing basketball together. Then we started playing golf together, which was quite an experience. And then we started talking about what it would look like to start a church. And it all started from me just asking God we were in the same stage and asked each other the same question. We built each other up. So pray for them. Pray for them. Secondly, look for them. Be intentional. We're told to pray. We're also told to be watchful when we pray. Look for God. He might just answer, even though you're not expecting him to. Look for it. Look for opportunities for those meaningful connections. It's why we do groups. It's why we do Sunday dinner. It's why we're doing I Said This, You Heard That. We just try to give people stay a little late after the service. Have a bagel. Let your kids talk to each other. Look for opportunities. Maybe join the team. One of the best things about joining the team is just working alongside someone. And you might see okay, this guy is actually like me. And all of a sudden, there's a friendship that forms that you didn't see coming. Plan for them. Build them into your schedule. Make it a rhythm. Prioritize them. When I was in college, every Sunday night was game night. Group of people came over to the house. We just played games. And it was a priority. We planned for it and around it. It was a rhythm, and it was life-giving to know, okay, today stinks, I got to do that, but tonight everyone's coming. It was a regular rhythm, and it was huge. It was huge. We're going to ask the band to come up, but here's what I want to leave you with. I told you, if you were here 2 weeks ago, I told you that probably about 6 or 7 years ago when I was working, I came to a place where I felt like I was burning out. And the guy that I was working with, the lead pastor of Three Village Church, he really pushed me to have a day off where I really just only rested. And right about that time, I had a friend that I wasn't really that close with at the time. But in addition to taking a day off and being disciplined about it, we also decided the two of us were going to hang out. It was on a Thursday night because on the weekends I'm busy. So on Thursday, he would come over to the house. And we would play basketball, and then we would play Madden, which is a game on Xbox. And we would gamble, not with money, but we would humiliate each other. So the winner got to make one time he waxed my thighs, and I left with burns and bruises. Most recently, he had to order at the drive-thru from Popeyes, and he had to say the word spinach 15 times throughout the course of the order. So we just do stuff like that, right? But here's what I'll tell you. What started as an acquaintance, eventually he became someone with whom my heart could relax. He, watched my kids grow up. He became a huge part of my life. We let each other in. We built each other up, and we called each other out. He called me out when he would see there was an issue going on, and I listened to him because I trusted him. And what I realized was that it not only made me feel better to have a rhythm where I was feeding this friendship, but it actually made me better to have a rhythm where I was feeding this friendship. I was a better dad because of my friendship with him. I was a better husband. I was a better pastor. I was a better friend. I was a better person because of this rhythm. And so what if we took those friendships we have now and tried to be a little bit more intentional with them? Tried to take them a little bit deeper, or looked for friendships where opportunities to let people in, build them. I know it will take time. It doesn't just happen overnight, but what if we did? Maybe then we would see the joy, like experience the relief of knowing people with whom like our hearts can relax. And then maybe we'll understand a little bit more what Jesus meant when he said we would find rest for our souls.